Today, I'll be showing you guys my updated 2026 U.S. Senate map prediction. With the 2025 races now behind us, the midterms are now less than a year away. And in this video, I will tell you where the balance of power in the upper chamber of Congress will stand for the second half of President Trump's term. And so we're just going to get right into it, starting off with the safe states for both parties, races where Republicans and Democrats are going to easily win by margins of 15 percentage points or more. And so starting off with the safe Republican seats, we have Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, and South Carolina. For the Democrats, we have Oregon, Illinois, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Delaware. The GOP starts off with a 5-point lead at 45, Democrats at 40. And so it's really going to come down, actually, to only these 15 races. The states we've already filled in are not going to be consequential in determining which party will control the U.S. Senate. However, in these 15 remaining states, we can break them up into a few more categories. We're going to begin with the likely races. These are states that either party is going to win by margins of 5 to 15 points. So they're going to be a little bit more competitive than the safe states, but one candidate still does have a pretty clear edge in each of them. We're going to begin down in Florida, where we have a special election. Ashley Moody is the incumbent senator. She was appointed earlier this year by Ron DeSantis to fill the vacancy left by Marco Rubio. And so her temporary appointment will end in 2027. And so if she wants to serve all the way until 2029, which would have been the end of the last term that Rubio secured in 2022, she will need to win this special election. And then in 2028, she will have to run again if she wants to serve a full 6 years. And according to the polling data, she is going to win this race. She leads by 9 points on average against Jennifer Jenkins, the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination. She has led in both of the polls released by nearly double-digit margins. And so Ashley Moody is on track to win 2 more years in the upper chamber of Congress. Florida is going to be likely red. Next up, in Texas, John Cornyn is seeking re-election to a 5th term, but in order to do that, he will have to survive a primary challenge from the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton. Ken Paxton resonates more with the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. According to Kalshi, he currently has a 37% chance of winning the nomination. Meanwhile, odds for Cornyn sit at just 40. And so there's a very realistic chance that John Cornyn won't even win the primary to be the Republican nominee, but if he does, he will have a very good chance of winning re-election. On the Democratic side, it's going to be Colin Allred, who is going to be the Democratic nominee for a second time in a row. In 2024, he was the nominee and lost to Ted Cruz by 8.5 points. In 2018, for reference, Beto O'Rourke was a Democratic candidate and only lost by 2.6. And currently, polling between Cornyn and Allred shows the Republicans leading by just under 5 points, with the GOP ahead by 4.8, according to our polling average. And so Texas will be the second likely red state on our map. John Cornyn is still more likely than not to hold on, in my opinion. He is probably going to be reelected a 5th time. The next race we're going to look at is Alaska, where Dan Sullivan is seeking re-election to a 3rd term. The Republican incumbent was first elected back in 2014, and he could be challenged by Mary Peltola. The reason why I say could is because Peltola could very well actually run for the governorship instead, where she would have a better chance, as the Senate race does have more national implications, and in those races, partisan politics plays a larger role. Alaska is still a safe red state, a state that Trump carried by 13 points against Kamala Harris. And according to the polling data between Dan Sullivan and Mary Peltola, Republicans lead by just under 1%, with the GOP at 46, Democrats at 45.3. But if we do look at the actual polls, many of them were sponsored by Democrat-funded organizations, which means that these numbers do skew in favor of Democrats more than they should. And so ultimately, Dan Sullivan is going to win re-election. It's very unlikely he is going to lose, but Mary Peltola entering the race will make things a lot more interesting. And the 4th and final likely red state will be Iowa, where Joni Ernst, the incumbent Republican, is not seeking re-election to a 3rd term, and so this paves the way for Ashley Hinson to become the next senator for Iowa. She is a current member of Congress elected in 2020, and according to the market odds on Kalshi, she has a 95% chance of being the Republican nominee. The primary is now basically over. And if we do look at the polls that we do have, between Joni Ernst and Josh Turek. Josh Turek is the Democratic frontrunner. Joni Ernst leads by 4%. She is not very popular in her home state. That's one of the big reasons why she isn't running for re-election. And so with Ashley Hinson at the top of the Republican ticket, she is probably going to win by more than 5%. Iowa is going to be the final likely Republican seat, and so this gets Republicans up to 49. Moving on now to the likely blue states, we have 3 races that aren't going to be super competitive, but the margins will fall just below 10%. We don't even have any polling data for these races because these are seats that Democrats are very, very unlikely to lose. And so we're going to begin out west with Colorado, where John Hickenlooper will win re-election to a second term. And then in neighboring New Mexico, Ben Ray Lujan, also elected in 2020. He will also win re-election to a second term. And then finally in Virginia, Mark Warner is on track to win re-election. He was first elected back in 2008. And so in all 3 of these races, Democrats are going to win by around 10 points. But again, probably not by more than 15. And so with all of these solid and likely states now filled in, the GOP leads with 49, Democrats at 43. And so we're now getting to the final stretch. We have 8 races remaining. 6 of them are going to fall into the lean category. These are races defined by margins of 1 to 5 percentage points. These elections are going to be very close. They will be very competitive. They will make national news, and they could realistically go either way. But one candidate and one party still does have a very slight edge in each of them. And we're going to begin up in the Midwest with Michigan, where Gary Peters, the incumbent Democrat, who was barely reelected in 2020, is not seeking re-election. He won by less than 2% against John James, who is now running to become governor. And so instead, on the Republican side, we have Mike Rogers as the presumptive nominee. He's already received the endorsement of President Trump, and he performed very well in 2024 when he lost to Alyssa Slotkin by less than half a percentage point. This race was not expected to be close. Mike Rogers was barely given any funding, and Slotkin was supposed to win by upwards of 7 to 8%. And so Republicans have found a very strong candidate in Mike Rogers, who is also a former member of Congress. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, Mallory McMorrow, a member of the Michigan State Senate, is the current favorite. And according to the market odds on Kalshi, she has a 48% chance of being the Democratic nominee. Although we do still have quite a crowded field, the primary is far from over, but for now, McMorrow is the favorite. According to the polling data, Republicans have a healthy 5-point lead. Rogers at 47, McMorrow at 42. Mallory McMorrow is probably the weakest out of the 3 Democratic candidates vying for the nomination. And if we look at the individual polls, according to the most recent one conducted by Rosetta Stone, Rogers leads by a whopping 7%. This is a seat that Democrats currently control. And so according to the data that we have and the fact that Mike Rogers is a much better candidate than Mallory McMorrow with their respective parties, the GOP is on track to take Michigan. It's going to be the first flip on our map. Republicans are now at 50 seats, with Michigan turning red. Moving on to neighboring Ohio, we have a second special election in the Buckeye State. This time, it's John Husted running for re-election. He was appointed earlier this year by Governor Mike DeWine to fill the vacancy left by J.D. Vance. And so his Democratic challenger is likely going to be Sherrod Brown, the former Democratic senator who was voted out of office in 2024. He lost to Bernie Moreno by just under 4 points. And so Brown is the best candidate Democrats could have nominated here, and he will make this race a bit closer than it would be without him. However, according to the polling data, John Husted still leads by nearly 3 points. And if we look at the most recent poll conducted by YouGov, it does have Brown ahead by 1%. But overall, John Husted is performing well. Ohio is a red state, a state that Trump carried by a double-digit margin in 2024. It is very unlikely he is going to lose. And if we look at the market odds on Kalshi, the GOP has a 62% chance. The odds have actually gone down as a result of the 2025 elections. But in the end, the 2025 races will have a very minimal impact on what happens next year. Ohio will be lean red. John Husted is on track to win another 2 years before he can run for the full 6. And then the final lean state that we have for the GOP will be Nebraska. It's surprising to see Nebraska not in the solid red category. And the main reason for this is because we have an independent running against incumbent Senator Pete Ricketts, who is running for a full term. He won a special election in 2024. It was by a 25-point margin, an easy victory. That's what normally happens in Nebraska. However, in 2024, we also had a regular election where Deb Fischer almost lost to Dan Osborne. She won by just under 7 points. Dan Osborne is an independent candidate, and he is running again in 2026 to challenge Pete Ricketts this time. And according to the polling data, we actually have a tie between the two candidates. We've had 2 polls released over the last few months. However, they are all polls conducted by Democrat-funded organizations, and so these numbers are going to skew more in favor of Dan Osborne. Democrats aren't even going to nominate a candidate here because, as you see, when they do, they really have no chance in a solid red state like Nebraska. Ultimately, though, Pete Ricketts is going to win re-election. There's really not too much doubt about it. If we look at the market odds, Ricketts has a 78% chance of winning. Nebraska simply isn't going to be that close. Of course, Dan Osborne will make this race a lot more competitive than it would be without him, but Republicans are in a good spot in Nebraska. It is a heavily Republican state, and it will be the GOP's 52nd seat on our map. We're going to shift our focus over now to the lean blue states, starting off in North Carolina, where I expect a second flip, as I do not believe Republicans will hold on to the seat currently held by Thom Tillis. Tillis was barely reelected in 2020. He won by less than 2%. He wouldn't have won if it wasn't for a major scandal that hit Cal Cunningham and the Democrats very late in the campaign in October, right before the election. And so this time, Democrats will nominate Roy Cooper, and Republicans are going to nominate Michael Whatley. Tillis is not running for re-election, which was a smart thing for him to do because he wouldn't have won. And so the Democratic candidate is, of course, the popular former governor. Roy Cooper is by far the best candidate Democrats could have put up here. Michael Whatley, though, is a strong candidate himself as well. He is the former chair of the RNC, and he already has the backing of President Trump, so he is going to make it through the primary without any problems. According to the polling data, Democrats lead by 5%. Roy Cooper does seem to be in a pretty good position in this race. He simply is a popular former governor, and according to the most recent polling data, Cooper is ahead by around 4 to 6 points. So Democrats do have a lead here, but it's not impossible for Michael Whatley to catch up. He simply isn't as well known in North Carolina yet. He's more of a national figure, and so if he does get the time to campaign more, and if he's effective with that, he will have a shot. But as of right now, North Carolina does seem to be trending in favor of the Democrats, and so we have the second flip on our map with the Tar Heel State flipping in favor of Roy Cooper. North Carolina will be the first lean blue state. And the second is going to be New Hampshire, where Jeanne Shaheen, the incumbent Democrat, is not seeking re-election despite winning by 16 points in 2020. And so instead, we have Chris Pappas as the Democratic nominee, and on the Republican side, it's going to be John Sununu. It's not going to be Scott Brown, who is also a former U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, but John Sununu is a former U.S. Senator from New Hampshire. He served from 2003 to 2009 when he lost his re-election to Jeanne Shaheen. And so now that she's retiring, Sununu wants to return to Congress, and he will win the Republican nomination pretty easily. However, New Hampshire is a state that generally favors Democrats, so it's not going to be an easy victory. And according to the polling data, Chris Pappas leads by 3.5%. This race is a lot closer than it was before when Scott Brown was expected to be the Republican nominee. The Sununu family is incredibly popular in New Hampshire. I mean, Chris Sununu was reelected 3 times as governor over the last 8 years. He just left office earlier this year. And according to the polling data, Pappas is at 46, Sununu at 42. The most recent poll shows just a 3% margin separating the two candidates. And according to the betting markets on Kalshi, Democrats have a 75% chance, but the odds for Republicans have been ticking up from a low of 9% back in April, now up to 25. And so the Granite State will be lean blue. Democrats are currently slightly favored here, but this race can get a lot more competitive, and it will definitely be one to watch. And the final lean state we have is Minnesota, where Tina Smith is retiring after a term and a half in the upper chamber of Congress. And so instead, Peggy Flanagan is likely going to be the Democratic nominee. She's the current lieutenant governor of Minnesota, serving alongside Tim Walz. And if we look at the market odds on Kalshi for the Democratic nomination here, she's at 70. Angie Craig, a current member of Congress, is at 32. So we do still have a slight primary battle going on, but Flanagan is the clear favorite. On the Republican side, Royce White is expected to be the Republican nominee once again. He lost by around 15 points to Amy Klobuchar in 2024, but Klobuchar is incredibly popular in Minnesota, so you can't blame Royce too much for that. And if we look at the polling data, Flanagan only leads by 2% against a generic Republican. That is how the question was phrased. And so it doesn't really mean too much here, but Minnesota has been getting more and more competitive. Just look at 2024 when Kamala Harris won the state by just 4 points, despite having Tim Walz, the state's literal governor, on the ticket with her. And so Minnesota will be lean blue, and it will give Democrats their 46th seat. And so we're now left with just the two final races, the elections in Maine and Georgia. I'm going to begin up top in Maine. Both of these races will be defined by tilt margins of less than 1%. These are going to be incredibly close, and they really are just pure toss-ups. And so starting up in Maine, Susan Collins is the incumbent U.S. Senator. She is seeking re-election to a 6th term in office. She is already Maine's longest-serving member of Congress in the state's history. She was reelected in 2020 by an 8-point margin, even though everybody expected her to lose. She was trailing in basically every single poll to Sarah Gideon, but somehow she won by 8 points on the same ballot where Joe Biden carried Maine by 9%. So she outperformed Trump in Maine by 17 points. Susan Collins has a very long history of success in Maine, and her running in this race is basically the only thing keeping the GOP's hopes alive, as without her, this seat would certainly trend blue. On the Democratic side, we have a two-way race for the nomination. On the left, we have Graham Plattner. He is the more progressive and younger candidate. Meanwhile, Janet Mills, the current governor, represents the establishment. She is actually older than Susan Collins, so that is going to be an issue for her. And according to the odds on Kalshi, we basically have a pure toss-up in terms of the odds for the Democratic nomination. Plattner is currently at 55, Mills at 45, but they have been trading places over the last couple of weeks. And if we look at the polling data between Plattner and Collins, we only have one poll that's been released thus far, and it did show a tie between the two candidates. However, this was a poll conducted by a Democrat-sponsored organization. And so if we compare this to what we saw in 2020, Susan Collins was losing by 3, 4, 5, 6 points in every single poll released. If Democrats are not even leading in the polls, it is unlikely they're going to win, but we are still in a very early stage. Susan Collins is not as popular as she used to be, but for now, based on all the data that we have, I will place Maine into the tilt Republican category. I think they have a very slight advantage as of right now. That, of course, can certainly change, but I definitely would not count Susan Collins out. And so the final election that we have will be the Senate race in Georgia. This, again, will be defined by a tilt margin, and this race is a lot simpler. A lot of races, we have a lot of messy primaries, but in Georgia, it is pretty clear. Jon Ossoff will be the Democratic nominee. He's the incumbent. He was elected in 2020 to a full 6 years alongside Raphael Warnock. On the Republican side, we have Mike Collins, a former trucker and a member of Congress. He's already secured the endorsement of President Trump, and so he is going to be the Republican nominee. And according to the polling data, Jon Ossoff leads by 2.3%, but this race does just keep getting closer and closer. Back in May, Ossoff led by 5. His margin has been cut in half now, basically. And if we look at the most recent poll conducted by Quantus Insights, this was a Republican-funded poll. However, it does show a dead heat between the two candidates. And so Jon Ossoff and Mike Collins will be in a very competitive race in the Peach State. But for now, given that Democrats do have the incumbency advantage, I will place Georgia into the tilt blue column. And so this is it. This is my updated 2026 U.S. Senate map prediction. Republicans are on track to win and retain control of the upper chamber of Congress at 53 seats, Democrats at just 47. I expect Republicans to hold on to Maine by a narrow margin, as well as flip Michigan, and Democrats to narrowly take Georgia, as well as flip North Carolina. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like this video down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which races you're watching, and do you agree with this map? And make sure you subscribe for more content just like this leading up to the midterms next year.